When we picture a Crusader fortress, we often imagine towering walls, proud knights, fluttering banners, and the promise of security. From the outside, these castles appear as symbols of power and triumph, monuments to an age of faith and war. Yet, behind those imposing gates and beneath the cold stone walls, life told a very different story, one marked not by glory, but by struggle, misery, and fear. For the thousands who lived within, a fortress was less a sanctuary and more a cage. Food supplies were uncertain, especially during sieges, when starvation reduced nobles and peasants alike to desperation. Water, stored in cisterns or wells, often turned foul, spreading disease faster than any invading army. The air inside the cramped courtyards and dim chambers carried the stench of smoke, waste, and sickness, where epidemics claimed lives long before battle could dot day to day. Strict obedience ruled every corner of the fortress. Lords commanded, knights trained relentlessly, servants labored under crushing demands. Women were bound by duty, often confined to the inner halls, while children grew up in a world where war and punishment were everyday realities. Even moments of peace were overshadowed by the dread of sudden raids, betrayals, or the next call to arms. Far from the romance of medieval legend, life in a Crusader fortress was a nightmare endured by those who had no choice but to call it home. This is the untold reality of survival behind the walls that history celebrates as symbols of strength. Chapter 1. Walls of Stone. Cages of fear. When we imagine medieval fortresses built by the Crusaders, the first thought that comes to mind is strength. Towering stone walls, drawbridges over deep moats, iron gates that could resist entire armies. These castles were built to withstand time, siege, and fire. They were the pride of their lords and the envy of their enemies. From a distance, they looked like invincible havens, but for the people trapped inside, those very walls became symbols of fear, confinement, and despair. The illusion of safety. The primary purpose of a fortress was defense, not comfort. Every stone was laid with the expectation of war. The walls were thick, sometimes more than 10 feet wide, designed to resist battering rams and trebuchets. Towers loomed high, not for beauty, but to rain arrows and boiling oil on attackers. Yet the stronger the walls grew, the more isolated those inside felt. In times of siege, gates were barred, bridges raised, and everyone was locked inside. What was meant as protection became a prison. Weeks turned to months as food dwindled and fresh air disappeared behind smoke-filled halls. The sounds of enemy drums and siege engines echoed day and night, a constant reminder that death waited just beyond the walls. Psychological weight of stone. Imagine standing in a courtyard, surrounded by stone on all sides, knowing that outside, thousands of enemy soldiers were waiting for your weakness. The walls that once inspired pride now closed in like a tomb. People began to whisper, would help come? Would the enemy breach the gates? Would they be starved out before rescue arrived? This mental strain often broke people long before swords were drawn. Soldiers on the walls suffered exhaustion, standing guard endlessly under the scorching sun or freezing wind. Inside, women and children lived in terror of what might happen if the walls failed. Rumors spread like wildfire, of tunnels being dug beneath the fortress, of traitors within who might open the gates, of cruel fates awaiting the captured. Daily life in the cage beyond, fear of the enemy. Daily life inside a fortress was suffocating. Space was limited. Entire families shared tiny chambers with no privacy. Servants, soldiers, and nobles crowded into the same courtyards, competing for limited resources. Fires for cooking filled the air with smoke, mixing with the stench of animals and waste. Even the noble halls were dark and damp, as sunlight rarely penetrated through narrow arrow slits. At night, the silence was broken by the creak of watchmen on the walls, the barking of dogs, and distant war horns. Sleep was shallow, interrupted by fear of surprise attacks. For peasants and servants, work never ceased. They carried water, ground grain, repaired walls, and tended to the animals, all under the constant awareness that any day could be their last. The fortress as a symbol of fear to the Crusaders' enemies. The castle was a terrifying symbol of foreign power, but to those inside, it was a cage. Nobles might have claimed that the walls brought security, but the people who lived beneath their rule often cursed the stone. Unlike open villages, there was no escape, no running into forests or mountains. Once the gates closed, every soul was trapped, from lord to peasant. Prisoners taken during raids were sometimes kept in the fortress dungeons, adding to the atmosphere of fear. The screams of captives echoed through the halls, reminding everyone that these walls were not just defenses, but tools of control. Hope turned into dread in theory. The fortress was supposed to be a place of unity, where soldiers and civilians rallied together in defense of faith and family. In reality, it was often filled with division, suspicion, and despair. Lords distrusted their men, soldiers resented their lords, civilians hated both, but had no power to change their fate. As weeks dragged into months during sieges, people often began to wish for the walls to fall, simply to end their suffering. Conclusion: the Crusader fortress stood as a monument of power to outsiders, but to those within, it was a cage of stone. It robbed them of freedom, fresh air, and hope. Safety came at the cost of fear. The very walls meant to protect life became the chains that bound it. Behind those high battlements, where sunlight rarely touched and fear never left, living in a fortress was not glory. It was survival in a prison built of stone. Chapter 2. Hunger. Behind the gate. Stone walls could keep out enemy armies. They could not keep out hunger. Inside a Crusader fortress, food was more valuable than gold, and water was more precious than blood. For those who lived within, every meal was a reminder of how fragile survival truly was. The siege and the stomach's greatest fear of any fortress was a siege. Armies that could not break the walls sought instead to starve them out. Surrounding fields were burned, livestock driven away, and every road patrolled to cut off supplies. Once the gates closed, the fortress had only what was stored within: barrels of grain, salted meat, dried beans, and whatever water could be drawn from wells or cisterns. At first, rations seemed manageable. Soldiers were issued bread and porridge, lords dined on richer meals, and peasants scraped what they could. But as weeks dragged into months, the storerooms grew bare, bread became mouldy, meat rancid, and water stale. Hunger gnawed at every belly, stripping away strength and morale. Desperation in daily life for the poor. Life was harshest. Servants often ate the scraps left behind by nobles, sometimes boiled weeds or animal bones to make a thin soup. Children cried in the night from hunger, their mothers powerless to comfort them. Even the proud knights, trained for battle, found their bodies weakening as rations shrank to crumbs. Accounts from chroniclers tell of people reduced to boiling leather shoes or gnawing on tree bark for sustenance. In the worst moments of famine, darker rumors spread, whispers of cannibalism, of the weak sacrificed so the strong could endure. Whether or not all these stories were true, the fact that people believed them shows just how desperate life could become. Water. The silent enemy. While food could be rationed, water was far more difficult to control. Many Crusader castles depended on rainwater collected in cisterns or on wells dug deep into the ground. But once a siege began, enemies often targeted these lifelines, poisoning wells or cutting aqueducts. Inside, stagnant water grew foul with insects and disease. Dysentery, cholera, and fevers spread faster than any army's sword. To drink was a necessity, but each cup risked sickness. Families faced an impossible choice: thirst or poison. Nobles versus commoners. Hunger did not strike equally. Lords and their families often kept private stores of food, hidden in locked chambers. Soldiers were given priority, since their strength was needed on the walls. The peasants, who formed the backbone of daily labor, were often left to starve first. This inequality bred bitterness. Resentment festered when starving peasants saw their lords eating salted fish or sweetmeats in guarded halls. Loyalty weakened. A hungry soldier was more likely to desert, and a starving servant was more likely to betray his master. In this way, famine itself became a weapon more dangerous than swords. The siege mentality food scarcity changed people. At the start of a siege, rations were carefully counted, discipline was enforced, and hope still lingered. But as time dragged on, humanity wore thin. Neighbors accused each other of stealing. Mothers hid food from their own children to stretch rations. A single loaf of bread could spark riots in the courtyard. The constant hunger gnawed not only at bodies, but at minds. Despair whispered in the dark, telling people that surrender might be better than starving. And when surrender came, it often meant massacre or slavery. Hunger forced people into impossible choices, each more brutal than the last. Moments of relief lit every day was misery. When supply caravans managed to sneak past enemy lines, or when hunters captured game from nearby woods, there were moments of celebration. Fires lit, pots boiled, and the smell of roasted meat filled the fortress with fleeting hope. But these were rare, and the joy always short-lived. Tomorrow, hunger would return. Hunger behind the gates was more than an inconvenience. It was the silent killer of fortress life. Armies outside could wait patiently, knowing that starvation would do their work for them. Inside, the proud Crusaders, knights, nobles, and peasants alike were reduced to shadows of themselves, fighting not for faith or glory, but simply for one more bite, one more sip, one more day. The grand fortresses that still stand today may inspire awe, but their stones carry a darker memory of hollow stomachs, dry throats, and the quiet, endless suffering of those trapped within. Hunger, more than sword or flame, was the weapon that turned a fortress from a symbol of strength into a nightmare of survival. Chapter 3. Disease in the shadows. If hunger was the slow killer inside Crusader fortresses, disease was its swift and merciless companion. Behind the heavy walls, where thousands of people were forced into close quarters, sickness spread like wildfire. For those who lived in these fortresses, illness was not just an occasional fear. It was a daily shadow that lingered in every hall, every chamber, every breath. A fortress full of people. Few means of cleanliness. Crusader castles were not designed for comfort or hygiene. They were built to withstand siege, to intimidate, and to defend, not to keep people healthy. Within the walls, space was cramped. Soldiers, nobles, peasants, servants, and sometimes even prisoners lived shoulder to shoulder. Animals were often housed inside during sieges, bringing with them fleas, lice, and disease. The air was heavy with smoke from fires, the stench of waste, and the damp chill of stone halls. With little fresh air or sunlight, infections thrived. Cuts from labor or battle festered into fatal wounds. A simple cough could spread to dozens within days. Water that poisoned instead of healing. Clean water was a rarity. Wells and cisterns inside the fortress were often the only sources, but during sieges, these quickly became contaminated. Soldiers washed, animals drank, and waste often leaked into the same supplies meant for drinking. Diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever became commonplace. Victims suffered agonizing cramps, vomiting, and unstoppable diarrhea that drained the life from their bodies. More soldiers and civilians died from foul water than from the blades of enemy armies. The plague within the Warshire story remembers the great plagues that swept across Europe. But smaller epidemics erupted constantly in crowded fortresses. Outbreaks of measles, smallpox, and influenza devastated garrisons. With no understanding of germs, people often crowded the sick together, believing confinement would contain the illness, when in truth, it only accelerated its spread. One sick child could infect an entire household. One wounded soldier could bring a fever that decimated his unit. In the dim torchlight of fortress chambers, rows of the dying lay on straw mats, whispering prayers as priests offered last rites. Primitive medicine and cruel cures. Doctors of the time relied on superstition more than science. Bloodletting, burning herbs, or applying leeches were the most common treatments. Some believed illness came from sin, and that prayer or penance was the only cure. Others resorted to bizarre remedies, ground animal bones, mixtures of honey and vinegar, or even the ashes of burnt toads, instead of curing disease. These practices often weakened the body further. Many died not from the sickness itself, but from the so-called cures administered in desperation. The fear of the sick, fear of disease shaped life inside the fortress as much as hunger or war. The sick were often abandoned, shunned even by their families. Corpses piled up faster than they could be buried. During sieges, there was often no way to remove the dead, and bodies were dumped in corners, basements, or wells, further spreading contagion. Priests and healers risked their lives to comfort the sick, but many were struck down themselves. Superstitions grew. Some believed that sickness was a curse sent by God, others that enemies had poisoned the air. In the end, it was not curses or plots, but the simple reality of too many people trapped in too small a space. Disease as a weapon. Enemy armies sometimes turned illness into a weapon. Historical accounts tell of diseased corpses catapulted over fortress walls, or rotting animals dumped into wells. The smell alone spread terror, but worse was the sickness that followed. Armies did not always need to storm the gates. Disease would do their work for them. The endless Shadavan, when no siege loomed. Life in a fortress carried constant risk of illness. Winters were cold and damp, summers hot and suffocating. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Rats and insects thrived in storerooms. For many, sickness was simply a part of life. Survival was less about avoiding disease and more about enduring until the next outbreak passed. Conclusion: Crusader fortress may have promised strength and safety, but it could not defend against its most relentless enemy, disease. Behind the mighty walls, hunger weakened bodies, and sickness finished the work. For every soldier who fell on the battlefield, dozens more died coughing in the shadows, rotting in the dark halls of their so-called sanctuary. In the end, these castles were not just monuments to war, but silent graveyards, where invisible killers claimed more lives than any sword. Chapter 4. Chains of obedience. Hunger starved the body, and disease rotted the flesh. Then obedience was the iron chain that bound every soul inside a Crusader fortress. Life within the walls was ruled not only by fear of enemies, but by the strict hierarchy of power. Lords commanded, knights enforced, servants labored, and peasants endured. No one was free. The fortress was not just stone and mortar. It was a system of absolute control, where obedience meant survival, and defiance meant ruin. The rule of the lorded, the top of the chain, stood the lord of the fortress, a nobleman who ruled with unquestioned authority. His word was law, often backed by the justification of divine right. In theory, he protected his people. In practice, he demanded loyalty, service, and sacrifice. Every ration, every decision of war or peace, every punishment passed down flowed from his will. Those who questioned his judgment risked being branded as traitors. Disobedience was not a matter of debate. It was a death sentence. The enforcers, knights and soldiers below the lord were the knights and men-at-arms, the iron fist of the fortress. They trained daily in the courtyards, drilling with swords, lances, and shields. Their duty was not only to defend the walls, but also to keep order among the people. For peasants and servants, the knights were both protectors and oppressors. They collected taxes, enforced labor, and punished anyone who broke the lord's rules. A stolen loaf of bread, a whispered complaint, even a late arrival to guard duty could lead to brutal floggings, imprisonment, or worse. The sword was not only for the enemy outside, it was a constant reminder of discipline inside. The weight on servants and peasants at the bottom of the chain were those who labored endlessly, the servants, cooks, blacksmiths, farmers, and children who kept the fortress running. They woke before dawn, hauling water, grinding grain, tending fires, and carrying out every menial task demanded of them. For these people, obedience was not optional. Refusal meant starvation, exile, or death. Women often bore the heaviest burdens, tasked with cooking, cleaning, and caring for the sick, all while living under the threat of abuse from those above them. Children learned obedience from their earliest years, their childhood spent in servitude rather than play. The chains of religion obedience in the fortress was not enforced only by swords and whips, but also by faith. The church declared that loyalty to one's Lord was loyalty to God. Priests preached that disobedience was sin, that suffering was holy, and that entrance in misery was the path to heaven. Religion gave the people comfort, but it also bound them tighter to their rulers. To defy a noble was not just rebellion, it was heresy. The people knelt not only before their Lord, but before a God who, they were told, demanded obedience above all. Punishment and fear. To maintain obedience, punishment was swift and merciless. Stocks, whipping posts, and dungeons were always in use. Traitors were hanged at the gates, their bodies left as warnings to others. Some punishments were even crueler: branding, mutilation, or confinement in cells so small a man could barely move. These acts were meant not just to punish the guilty, but to terrify the innocent into compliance. Fear was the true chain that held the fortress together. Moments of resistance, yet, even in this system of control, resistance flickered. Servants sometimes stole food, peasants muttered curses in secret, and soldiers deserted their posts under cover of night. Some mothers defied the rules to hide food for their starving children, but such acts were rare and dangerous. Most people chose submission, knowing that survival depended on obedience, however unjust it felt. Obedience in war, and the irony of fortress life, was that the same obedience that crushed spirits was also what kept the fortress alive during war. When enemies approached, every hand was needed on the walls. Order had to be absolute. The chain of command, harsh as it was, gave structure to chaos. Without obedience, the fortress would collapse into anarchy. Thus, people obeyed, not always out of loyalty, but out of necessity. Conclusion: the Crusader fortress was not merely a cage of stone, but a cage of power. Its walls held bodies, but its laws held souls. Obedience ruled every aspect of life, enforced by lords, knights, and the church, sustained by fear and faith alike. For those who lived within, there was no freedom, only the endless weight. The Crusader fortress was built for war, and war never ended. Even when no enemy marched on its gates, the shadow of conflict lingered over every stone. For those who lived within, peace was only an illusion, a pause between battles. The fortress was not simply a home, it was a battlefield waiting to ignite, and its people were prisoners of an endless cycle of fear and bloodshed. The constant threat life inside a Crusader stronghold was dominated by the expectation of attack. Enemy armies might appear at any moment, whether Saracens in the east, rival knights in Europe, or even fellow Crusaders vying for power. Every sunrise brought the same anxious question: would today be the day? The horns sounded from the watchtowers. This constant fear shaped the rhythm of daily life. Children grew up knowing the sound of clashing steel before they ever learned lullabies. Mothers kept bundles of food ready for sudden flight into hidden chambers. Men slept with swords within reach. The fortress was never at rest, because war was always near. Drills and preparations to survive the endless threat. Training never stopped. Knights drilled in the courtyards, practicing swordplay, archery, and cavalry maneuvers. Peasants and servants were pressed into labor, hauling stones to repair walls, sharpening weapons, and storing barrels of oil, water, and grain. Even when no enemy was visible, the fortress lived as if siege were imminent. Watchmen patrolled night and day, bells and horns ready to summon all to arms. For the people, these preparations were exhausting. To live inside a fortress was to live inside a war machine, one that consumed every ounce of strength from its inhabitants. The fear of betrayal of the enemy outside the walls was not always the only danger. Rumors of spies, traitors, and secret deals spread constantly. Could a servant be bribed to open a gate? Could a soldier desert to guide the enemy? This fear poisoned relationships. Neighbors distrusted neighbors, and loyalty was tested daily. When treachery was suspected, punishment was brutal. Suspected traitors were tortured for confessions, hanged from the battlements, or thrown into dungeons. Even if innocent, the accused rarely left the ordeal alive. The fear of betrayal was as destructive as any sword, tearing apart the fragile unity of those inside. The cost of endless conflictive siege, every battle, every raid left scars. Soldiers returned maimed, peasants lost families, women were widowed, and children were orphaned. Fields outside the walls lay burned and barren, ensuring hunger lingered long after the enemy withdrew. Disease followed armies like a shadow, spreading to the fortress once the fighting ended. Even victory carried no joy. A defeated enemy today returned tomorrow with greater strength. The fortress was a cycle of survival, not triumph. War was not a season to endure. It was the permanent climate of life. The normalization of violence over time. Violence became normal. Executions in the courtyard, bodies hanging from the walls, and the screams of prisoners became part of daily background noise. Children grew up playing among broken weapons, servants cleaned blood from stones, and soldiers drank away memories of slaughter. The fortress itself seemed to breathe war. Its stones echoed with the clash of training. Its halls whispered with tales of raids. Its gates groaned open only to unleash more violence. For those who lived inside, war was not an interruption of life. It was life itself, the weariness of the people, and yet, beneath all the duty and obedience, a quiet weariness spread. Ordinary people longed for peace, for open fields, for a life beyond the shadow of walls. Some dreamed of escape, though few dared attempt it. Others placed their hope in God, praying that one day the endless war would end. But for most, hope was fragile. The fortress was both their cage and their shield, binding them to a life of fear, hunger, and death. They endured not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Conclusion's Crusader fortress stood as a monument to strength, yet it was haunted by endless war. Behind its walls, people lived in a world where every breath carried fear, every day demanded obedience, and every night whispered the threat of death. For them, there was no lasting peace, only the cycle of battle and survival. The walls that promised protection instead imprisoned them in war without end. This was the true nightmare of fortress life, not just the hunger, the disease, or the chains of obedience, but the unrelenting truth that war never stopped. Outrow approximately equals 250 words. The towering Crusader fortresses that still stand today inspire awe. Tourists walk their stone corridors and marvel at their massive gates, imagining knights in shining armor and lords ruling from lofty halls. Yet behind the romance of these castles lies a far darker truth. For those who lived within, the fortress was not a sanctuary, but a prison. Hunger gnawed at their bodies as food supplies dwindled under siege. Disease spread unchecked in crowded, filthy chambers, claiming more lives than enemy swords ever did. Obedience was enforced with iron chains of authority and fear, crushing individuality and silencing defiance. And looming over all was the endless war, the unceasing shadow that shaped every moment of life inside. The great walls, once thought to be shields of safety, became barriers of despair, trapping men, women, and children in a cycle of suffering. To live in a Crusader fortress was to wake each day to fear. Fear of hunger, fear of sickness, fear of punishment, and fear of the enemy who never seemed far away. Today, these fortresses remain as silent witnesses to that nightmare. Their stones do not speak, but if they could, they would tell us not of glory and triumph, but of suffering and endurance. They remind us that history's proud monuments often conceal the misery of ordinary lives, and in their silence, they whisper a timeless truth, that survival, not glory, was the real legacy of fortress life.